Welcome to On the Soul's Terms podcast, a weaving of astrology, Greek mythology, and depth psychology. I'm Chris Skidmore, an astrologer, psychotherapist, and craniosacral therapist living in Ubud, Bali. Welcome back to On the Soul's Terms. In this episode, I'm joined once again by Dr. Carolina Herbert, a dear friend, therapist, and humanitarian worker who brings a deeply insightful perspective on navigating crisis and transformation. We recorded this episode in person here in Bali, sparked by a series of powerful conversations we've had over the past few days. Together we explore what it means to stay aligned in turbulent times, both personally and collectively, drawing from astrology, psychology, and Carolina's extensive experience in humanitarian work. We discuss the radical shifts happening in the world and how we, as individuals, can respond. We unpack the true meaning of catastrophe, not just as collapse, but as an invitation to turn inward, to break through outdated patterns, and to find a deeper, more grounded sense of self. We talk about Uranus as the great awakener, the tension between chaos and clarity, and what it means to cultivate courage in the face of uncertainty. This conversation is an invitation to consider your own patterns, your relationship with safety, and the ways you might be called to awaken to something new. If you've been feeling the weight of the world lately, this episode is for you. Let's dive in. Well, welcome back to On the Soul's Terms podcast. And I'm Chris Skidmore, and I'm joined today by a dear friend, someone who's been on the podcast twice, 3 times maybe. It seems like quite a lot of times. I think you're on my first ever podcast. It's possible, maybe second, something like that, like episode, if you go back and see, I think it's episode 2 or 3 maybe. Her name is Dr. Carolina Herbert, and she happens to be sitting here right with me in person in Bali. And we've just had the radical idea that we should really record a podcast together in light of this conversation we've been having throughout the afternoon and our experiences over the last few days. Carrie, or Carolina, welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I love this spontaneous nature of this chat. So looking forward to seeing what emerges.
Yeah, or what is emerging, because I think what inspired us to sit down and have this talk was like so many of the things that we were talking about just now really feel like they're personal on the one level and really interpersonal and really transpersonal on another. We're in such an interesting time in history. I know interesting is sort of a catch-all word, but a time that is very topsy-turvy, when we're talking about the catastrophe, the word catastrophe, and how to look at the etymology of catastrophe coming from Greek, which is a turning down or a turning over sort of experience. And as we were getting into that, feeling it, the idea kind of emerged that we would have a discussion really on those layers of reality that are the personal, the interpersonal, and going out into the world level and transpersonal levels, and trying to speak into the experience that I think a lot of us are in right now in this moment in history, 2025, a big turbulent year already, lots going on, natural disasters, political stuff, and all sorts of kind of, I don't know if it's okay still to use the word madness, but it feels like a lot of madness going on. And yet something that sort of we've been tracking is this ability to be with that same energy in a way, in a sort of radical way of finding a way into the deep interior, into this force that can sort of arise in the midst of all of that chaotic energy and come up and forward, right?
Yeah, and I think it's such a challenging time and a confronting time for us to kind of find how can we stay kind of grounded and aligned within ourselves, within so much chaos and within so much sense of dismantling and collapsing almost of what's been, I guess, some of the systems that have looked stable before, but they're not anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And as we started to talk, I just had a glimpse at the astrology of the moment, and here we have the moon has just moved into Gemini, and when this releases into the world, it will still be in Gemini. And we've had the planet Jupiter just having turned around from its retrograde and turned direct in Gemini. The moon's going to be meeting that in a moment. And also particularly Uranus, who has also just turned around and gone direct in Taurus. And I think the theme of our whole day, and maybe our whole week, I don't know how much detail we'll get into of the sort of things we've been exploring this week, because but the theme being very Uranian in the sense of electric energy, kind of chaotic shock. I think shock wave was the word that really resonated for us both, of like a shock wave energy. And yet at the same time, Uranian energy is the great awakener, the one that can see through all of the fog, and it tends to happen all of a sudden, and you arrive back into some kind of a essential, radical sense of self that comes like all the way through your being.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because it's such a confrontation, isn't it? I mean, I work in the humanitarian sector, and there's been such a sense of a shockwave rippling and ricocheting through the sector because there's been so much happening where work has been told to stop immediately, and there's so many vulnerable people involved in that impact. And I'm just witnessing that sort of ricochet and shockwave through organizations and teams right down to the individual, and just feeling like, and I guess, it goes into me too, and how am I going to be best able to support my clients, and how am I going to do that within myself? How am I going to go into that deep interior and navigate through that sense of shock? What needs to shapeshift, awaken, radicalize within me so that I can stay aligned and able then to respond to others who are completely bewildered by what's going on, as we all have had some degree of experience of that.
Yeah, well, I'd love if you were up for it to expand as much as you're allowed to, as much as you can, into that. Maybe you can share with the audience what your work is and what you do focus on, and what you've seen, especially recently, in that field.
Sure. I mean, my work, I'm primarily looking at the well-being of organizations and teams and individuals who work in the humanitarian sector. So this is people on the front line, people who are responding to complex needs and emergencies, crisis in different parts of the world, and often, some of the most difficult conflictual areas of the world. And, and I think, as we've seen what's happening with, the stopping of funds without any sense of transition or understanding of the implications and impact for not only the teams, but also the populations that they serve, I think it's been an absolute shockwave to the whole sector. And so I've been witnessing that, and very concerned when you've got a situation where the US have basically supported pretty much half of the industry of the humanitarian sector, rightly or wrongly, but there's something about then taking away that is like causing then a potential collapse of the whole system. And I think this is incredibly confronting for anyone working in the sector and anyone who is being supported by that sector. And we're talking about billions of people who will be impacted by this directly. So I think then, what does that mean? And I think my contact with people is, I'm talking with people who run organizations, people who are working in the front line of supporting people, and sometimes whole teams. And I think what I'm really interested in is how can I support people so that they're enabled to navigate and come into a place of groundedness in the midst of that level of not only crisis, chaos, it's like dismantling, it's like everything is sort of breaking down, back to what you were saying, that catastrophe, that spiraling down movement, with no sense of knowing what's next, what's to come. For people, I feel, so, the sense of outrage and heartbreak for those who've suddenly lost all their work and won't have any idea about whether they can get any more work if the industry is like this. So it's really shaking things up, and it's easy to get caught up in the chaos of it. And I think what this conversation is so important to consider is how can we even imagine the possibility of staying within the chaos and finding a sense of alignment. I know we've been talking about this concept of radical alignment, what does that actually mean? How do we find that? Which is not about not caring. It's not about not grieving or not being outraged or not protesting or any of those things. It's like coming into some kind of deeper state of clarity.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much that you're talking about here, but that thing, because this is, I guess, when we have the language of astrology, we can see it on the archetypal level, and it particularly feels Uranian, which this moment feels quite Uranian. The sun is in Aquarius, which is ruled by Uranus, and we've just had the new moon, and we're just sort of moving into this time. Everything's turning around, everything's moving on this year. It's like any astrologer will say, like, wow, it's like expect the unexpected in a year like this, because so much is going on, right? And we're only a month and a little bit into the year.
Oh my goodness.
and what can happen with this kind of energy is like a dissociative state, right? Because these are collective things happening on a big scale. And, that's why I love talking to you, because you have access that not so many people do to that humanitarian sector and to that big scale things going on in the world. But of course, like anyone, you deal with the human beings and the organizations and the teams that are within there. Now, as we talk about the shock wave or the catastrophe, however we want to see that, kind of two things we're talking about, shock wave and catastrophe, Uranian concepts in a way. There's a breaking apart and a falling apart, actually, that's kind of like going on, which some part of us, the more rebellious part of us, is like, okay, change. So if change is going to happen on a big level, but the actual lived experience of this kind of change can be so intense and so disastrous. And what can happen is all sorts of things, like dissociative frequencies can come up, like being completely overwhelmed, being completely checked out. And so what you're bringing in, and it's something that's sort of emerged into our conversations this week, is, well, not just conversations, but our lived experiences this week, is like something emerging, and it's like hard to speak to, right? Like this isn't something that we've maybe formulated and have a really good grasp of, and now we're going to give it to the audience, right?
No.
Because if it was that, it's not that, right? This is the kind of dilemma of this. Like Uranian energy is expect the unexpected, but how do you do that? Because once you've expected it, it's not unexpected.
Exactly. Exactly. And then what is called upon within, yourself to be able to navigate that, right? It's, I think it's hugely confronting. I'm thinking of people who are also being catapulted unexpectedly into having to be in survival mode, so you're not only in shock, but having to survive, because of what's happening, and without any sense of knowing what could happen next, so it's kind of calling upon maybe a whole different dimension of what we need to access within ourselves and collectively. I think it's really important to kind of dance between, my sense of my own sense of responsibility and agency, but also what are we doing together, and I think the conversations we've been having have been so helpful to kind of consider dropping deep into what does that mean at an individual level, and then we can draw into this relational field and consider how can we navigate this together, because I think if we think we're going to do it on our own, then we're also going to get lost in the mix of it. There's something about this connection and this relational field that is joining up forces in a way in a different dimension.
Yeah, because it really is. I mean, it's something that we really are all in it together in something like this, and perhaps catastrophe in particular brings us to the state of that. But of course it can also tear us apart, and of course that's also a reality that can happen. as well. But it's interesting because, you know, I want to work with this catastrophe word a little bit more. Michael Mead talks about the word catabasis, which is to take the journey to the underworld. It's got the kata sound in it, at least. And maybe if catastrophe is a turning down, maybe sort of we also need to turn ourselves down as far as, well, now that I've said that, it's like maybe we also need to turn down all the voices and turn down all of the noise in a way, because it's a very noisy world, isn't it?
Yeah, and I can, you know, and in many conversations I've had with people and just in my own reactions, you know, the sense is, well, that kind of outcry, outrage, it's that sense of out, the exterior of, which of course that's so important to express. I'm not sort of against any sense of expression or, you know, or the protest or the grief and the sorrow or the confusion, the chaos, you know, all these emotions, but I think it's part of that catastrophic storm in a way. So yes, to feel all of that, not to bypass it, but then I really love that idea of talking about, you know, to then go down and have the courage to kind of drop into a different place. And where does that take us? You know, where does that, what new ground can we find there is of really deep interest to me as well. It's both and, isn't it, I think? It's both and,
yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, if I think about the other big movement in the sky so far this year, which, you know, again, we're only a month or so in, but is that Pluto, god of the underworld, in Aquarius and the collective, you know, and in that sort of frequency of Aquarian consciousness, which is collective, and it's all of it can be all the busyness of all the sounds and all the noise and all the things, and you know, I think that there's something deep within all human beings that they want to make the world a better place. But in some ways, like, how do we go about that these days? Because it just seems all so big. All of the big things are falling down, you know, big things are falling apart. That seems to me to be the sort of nature of the beast at the moment. And that's something about that Pluto energy is a catastrophe in that sense of like the turning in and the turning down the noise and getting in and getting quiet and getting deep. And as you say, that's not to diminish the need for outrage and the need for outcry and the need for, you know, standing up for the people that are in dire need, and everything that you do in the humanitarian sector, which is literally the Aquarian sector, you know, so you're kind of working in the Aquarian realm. And at the same time, there was something that we discovered this week of a fresh, what I would consider Uranian frequency coming up through down in the bottom there, when everything feels kind of like hopeless and like there's nothing you can do about anything. This other energy seems to come up, and it's still disruptive in the same way that Uranian forces and Aquarian forces are disruptive energies, but it's disruptive in this different kind of way, because I witnessed it this week, you know, with you and some of the process that we're doing. I witnessed the actually arriving into this calm, clear, decisive, powerful place. It was very palpable, that place. And it's like, it's not separate from all of these energies. It seems like something that you could get if you go and become a monk and sit in a cave and just meditate for 20 years, and then you can achieve that. It's like, we don't have that luxury. This isn't the lives that most of us are living. So we're going to have to find that energy from within, the disturbances of the forces of nature and the forces of culture, right? Like, I mean, it's the forces of nature and the forces of culture that are in some crazy tornado state.
Yeah, and I think it's, yeah, totally. And I think there's this, and I've certainly felt it this week, this direct almost collision with programming and patterning that we have, you know, that's sort of so embedded. It's almost like, you know, when you think of that sense of, you know, the breaking down of something, the breaking through of something, but what does it then reveal? You know, if we focus on the breaking apart and we don't focus on actually something else even more powerful and important can come through, then we're going to miss a kind of perspective that we can focus on in the midst of chaos. So it's just like this sense of, having the opportunity to kind of really go there in my own process has been really powerful, because it is dismantling and confronting to kind of consider that the patterns I might have, they're not serving me, and then it's and actually I need a wake up call and a shake up, and I need something dismantling and breaking down. I don't particularly like it, maybe, it's like I would much rather just continue on the status quo, but that's not possible for me. And it's, and I think that sense of, we can be courageous to kind of look at within ourselves, what needs to happen within me, so then I can be better and able to respond to this time. And I didn't sort of go into this process to kind of, to literally, that wasn't my agenda, but but sitting on the other side of it, I'm thinking that's what it's all about. It's kind of a sense of inner outer, the kind of, I have to go down, that downward movement, that inwards movement, to confront whatever it is that's restricting and limiting me, and the energy that then needs to be in where I can be in my most radical alignment, my most true self, my most clear, decisive self, that may be accessing a part that I haven't, or has been dormant, or, cut off, dissociated, what you said, it's like, and then to kind of, almost resurrect that dimension of self can maybe bring a different perspective for everything in my life, and a different perspective to what is going on in the way that I see and perceive the world.
Yeah, and it's like on the way down, if it's a catastrophe that's turning down, on the way down, then there's going to be layer after layer of struggle and wrestle, isn't there? Including projection, and including, no, it can't be like this, and whatever happens on the way down that kind of needs to happen, like the system spitting itself out, or maybe you just want to return back to the status quo and put on a few more bandages and go, you know what, it's not as bad as all that, it's probably fine, and justify and help your mind sort of recognize and realize everything's sort of okay just as it is. But the deeper self that we can if we allow ourselves to go all the way down, that deeper self knows that none of this is okay anymore, right? Like, none of this is okay. And so it comes back up. And as it comes back up, it's like that kind of clarity that it seems like only by sort of going through that chaotic stuff, but actually going down and into it, can we even begin to find it? And then even then we might not, right? Like it's kind of, it's one of those things that again, there's so much noise that keeps us on these frequencies that are out of that. And I guess, what can be done is, by all of us, is I don't know what can be done, right? Like it's such a chaotic world. That's part of the dilemmas of this world. Not quite sure what can be done. But then this presents a different thing, right? Like, it's almost like with the last, say, 20 years with our phones and all of these kinds of things, with the advances of technology. I was in a session today with someone, we were talking about how important it is just to like stare for a while, right? Like how important it is just to stare off and look at nothing into the middle distance for a while. Because then the mind can sort of like drift off and fantasize a little bit. And then out of those fantasies, like some kind of action can sort of naturally arise. In the same way as what we're talking about here, these phones, they keep drawing us towards themselves and putting us in some form of dysregulation.
Or trance.
Yeah. And how do we break through either that dysregulation or trance?
And it's taken us out of ourselves, in the sense of becoming ungrounded. Because, I'm just thinking about that. What does it mean to be grounded in these times is I think extremely challenging, because it's, everything is changing at such a rapid speed. I think that's, one of the biggest challenges. And I think it's interesting to consider finding a deeper ground versus, we do a lot of work around this concept of how to help people to ground themselves, right, when they're dealing with trauma or crisis. And I still believe in those tools and those ways of working, but what does it mean to find a deeper ground? I think this is what this conversation is making me so curious about, to go down and through and beyond maybe any sense where we've maybe even felt safe before, or felt a place of knowing or a security. Because if everything is dismantling, then we have to find a deeper sense of all those things. And that's confronting.
Well, isn't it? I mean, it's confronting for both you and I as therapists, and so much of the stuff that we've learned and practiced, which I still believe in, it's not like this changes at all, but is to give safety, to give a sense of safety to the person you're working with, right? And then this week has kind of risen for me of like, what if I'm giving safety where there needs to be a little more unsafety there, so they can drop down into a place that's really safe, which is their own sort of potency and power and radical self that's down there. And we maybe cushion that, right? Like maybe there's a sense of, do we cushion the status quo of somebody's life that is not really working, but we make it okay?
Right. And I think we've certainly found that in our conversations this week, is actually it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it okay. And it's like, I think sometimes that sense of, the confrontation, or to stay with the breaking down of something that would have previously been, the way we were being in dialogue together, it just kind of opens up a whole new dimension of what does it mean to be literally confronted in relationship, so that you can face something within yourself and almost not be forced to go down, but be forced to face that kind of inner journey. And of course, there's always a choice, but it's like to be in best service, I think, as we are talking about as therapists, it's like to be in best service, I think sometimes there needs to be such a deep sense of confrontation. But we can't do that unless we are embodying that, right? And living that out. And that's always the big confrontation for me, is that I need to live what I am, in my practice, and embody that, which is, it's great, because then you're constantly confronted with journeying in a way that is refining that instrument of being the best channel, the best tool, the best being that you embody for the other. And I think I've certainly found that in our journeys this week of really, personally finding the dismantling of how I might normally relate, so that I can find a deeper source, actually, a deeper energy and a deeper clarity and focus and poise, and that can help me to, be much more aligned. But maybe not the way that I'm so familiar with, and maybe that others are so familiar with. So I'm appreciating the opportunity to really, to have that confrontation, to stay with the chaos of that, to be almost kind of slightly almost lost in the process, not knowing if I'm going to emerge from it, because I know, I somehow trust that something is going to come through that is of greater good, because of the sense of intention and care and love and compassion in the way that we journey. And of course, and then it does, and then something breaks through, and then it's like, it's been such an epiphany for me to realize that the patterns that don't serve me in my life, I can see them, and in seeing them, there can be a sense of, you can almost watch them break down and not have that same control, And all of us have patterns of some shape or form, right?
Yeah.
But
well, that's the universality of this, right?
Right. And I guess the question is, for those listening, is like, what pattern is in you that is undermining, who you really are, undermining your best self, your core, your happiness, your joy, your ability to be in relationship, to do the things you love, whatever that is, what is going on in you that's limiting you, and how can, you have the courage to begin to look at that or get support to look at that, to really find more freedom. I think there's more expansion then, that can be found in this place.
Yeah, and otherwise, the I guess the follow-up question would be around what patterns I might just be patching up, like just like I have the old car and I'm just like putting patches on it, and just a few kind of like surface level fixes, and it keeps breaking down. I'm like, it'll be fine. And eventually actually that old habit or that old pattern, we have to realize it's not going to be fine, like it's actually not going to be fine. Like the safety that you get is not real safety. And there's something that I witnessed in what we've discussed this week, and sort of alluding to that of dropping down somewhere underneath even the concept of safety. It's almost like the most unsafe place, isn't it, in a way, right? Because it's so deep and so deeply within, and once you're in that energy, it's kind of like, wow, anything could happen from here. But then something in that feels like a whole different range of safety, right? As you said, liberation, freedom, the ability to create new things in my life, the ability to stand up to other people's bullshit that keeps coming at me, or my own bullshit, right? That keeps getting in the way of me being able to see clearly. And that's why this energy that we refer to in astrological circles as Uranus is the great awakener, essentially, right?
Well, it's perfect, isn't it? That, that it's so mirrored in the planetary system just to guide us, to show us that, almost to gives that sense of like to not be afraid, to have that greater courage of heart. Yeah. In that sense of, I really like the concept of bravery, because, safety, like you said, it's like, I mean, what does that really mean? How do we really find it? Especially for some people in some environments, it just doesn't exist. Yeah. But bravery can exist. Bravery can exist in a war zone. Courage can exist there. And maybe it's finding those depths and those dimensions within ourselves and with our communities. And I'm sure if either of us had an opportunity to meet some people in Gaza at the moment, we'd meet person after person who is finding that degree of grit and courage in the midst of everything that's going on. It's in everyone. Right. But maybe sometimes it's only forged through staying with the most chaotic, destructive dimensions. And there's a confrontation then back to myself, so then I must, right? I must go to that down place through the layers of my previously assumed security and safety to find something deeper and to allow that to be confronted and challenged.
I love that you're bringing it so deeply personal to so fully collective, and it's one of those things, right? Like, because you have worked in these places, you do work in the most war-torn sort of places with people that are the most affected by that. You work in Cambodia for all those years as an example of that. So, just to get a sense of your own lived experience, how when the environment doesn't give you any safety and doesn't really offer the possibility of safety just arriving one day, right? Like, I mean, there must be some of the places that you've worked in that the hopelessness and despair and chaos just seem to be going on forever. What have you seen as far as like, how do people in that environment find, as you call it, bravery, and how is bravery linked therefore to some deeper level of what we would call safety?
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be a very interesting thing to research, right? Yeah. To really understand the nuance of that. I mean, I think at a personal level, and I think, when I felt unsafe, and gone through my own experience of not feeling safe or being overwhelmed because these circumstances are so threatening, maybe it's not even in the moment that it's possible, because maybe you are in survival mode, you have to get through something. There has to be some degree of stability or ground where you can drop in. But then I'm so interested in how we can become people who embody a sense of bravery or courage or that sense of safety. And I know in Cambodia, through our training programs there, we looked at this a lot with Cambodian people that we worked alongside to really explore how can we find that embodied sense of safety. But that means confronting your own sense of not feeling safe, which of course is ultimately linked to crisis or trauma or, injury. There's a reason why we haven't felt safe, or the breakdown of trust and all of those things. So it's like, and I think I really welcome the opportunity to take people on collective journeys in groups to really look at, so if there isn't any safety in this environment, what are we going to do? Is it just impossible? Or can we imagine a world where I can embody that? I can be that. I can bring that energetic for the other. Whether it's in a prison or whether it's in a war zone, there's a sense of I'm holding that by my own being, because I'm connected to something that's way bigger than me. Thank goodness, right?
Yeah.
It's way bigger than my own fragile humanity that does feel terrified, or does feel really like, I don't know how to stay with this unknown dimension or whatever's happening that feels potentially overwhelming. But to drop back to that down place, this deeper sense of self, that has almost like a completely different perspective. It's almost not holding that same sense of what we're dealing with at that human level. And if we can embody that and take that with us wherever we go into our lives and into our relationships and communities, then that's going to impact the other, right? That's going to enable someone else to share or to come close to you and feel like, they feel like someone I could actually explain what's going on in my world, and to then have their own courage. And it's interesting, I would be so curious too, that sense of your question, what is it that cultivates bravery in the midst of crisis? And what is the difference of that between different people? One for another long conversation.
One for another long conversation. I will say that as you were talking, I got a very big flash energy, because I was thinking of, Uranian energy, Uranus and all this kind of stuff. I was just kind of tuning into that as you were speaking, because like it's a primordial force actually that we're referring to. We've just given it this name. And of course, Uranus was the husband of Gaia. He was the sky father. And as you were talking about it, became very personal for me, because I started to think about my grandfather. Especially, both of my grandfathers were pretty beautiful, quite gentle, but yet powerful men. But my mum's father, Joe, was like, flying in the Second World War, rescuing POWs when the war had ended, and going into places where there was a lot of trauma, and there was something that he represented in my life through all of the chaotic stuff that would go on with us, the younger ones and the, others in the family, and all of our stuff that we would always go through. There was something always he maintained that, what I would call this thing that you're referring to, that is not exactly, it is a very safe energy, but it's safe because of the courage. And if we go back to that essence of courage being from the heart, it was that, but it's not just that he came from the heart. He actually brought action to that heartfelt experience, and then created safety not just for himself and within his own sphere, but for all of us in a way, and even on a more collective level. And he was always a very admirable man. I was blessed to have been there at his deathbed, and it was interesting to feel we were talking on such a collective level there. I was listening to it on such a collective level, and something so personal came in. And I wonder if that, for the audience as well, if you're listening on the collective level, if you can also find that personal level, right? Because I think one of the things of these times that gets us so discombobulated is that we're out of stories, we're out of good stories, we're out of good mythologies, we don't have great cosmology. And so we feel like there's just big wild forces happening here, big impersonal forces that are just much bigger than us. And we're out of the story. We're out of a collective story together. And something in the way that you shared that and how it came up for me to think about my granddad is like, yeah, I wonder if we could drop into those energies that really are brave and safe, and then find some way inside of ourselves to also be truth speakers and come into something real and come into something clear and come into something that might be, let's say, awakened, but not in the way that we would understand it, right? Like an energy force that's already awakened, that we as humans can go ahead and be completely out of it sometimes and completely in it sometimes, but connect to a force like that. So that's what sort of came up for me.
Well, it's so powerful, isn't it? I'm just imagining, the sense of what your grandfather then has given you and trusted you with into your own heart and your own capacity for that courage, and that courage to be vulnerable, right? It's and then being a person of action and response and service, and I can almost feel his support and energy, and it kind of makes me think of how what you were saying about being with him when he passed, the sense of how important it is to connect to our ancestors and to connect to ceremony, and almost like it makes me think of the big journey I did looking at indigeneity, and what does that mean to what do we really need to connect to and draw from in these times, and not get caught up in that the whirlwind of the collective, and to come together in circles and community and one-to-one and to have these brave conversations.
So beautiful. Yeah, I mean, the when you mentioned the vulnerability, I'd always just known him as such a strong, powerful man, but then I offered to write his memoirs in the last weeks of his life, which I didn't realize were the last weeks of his life. I never actually wrote them, but I interviewed him 6 times. And he shared so vulnerably with me, so I think that was a great permission giver for me that strength didn't mean some macho, heroic, Herculean sort of armored thing. The strength that he showed was actually very, very much full of compassion, vulnerability. I saw him break down himself because he, on the TV on his deathbed, there was a plane that had gone over the landing, right? A plane crash, and that had happened to him when he was rescuing POWs. So I saw him go back into the trauma, these traumas that are so collective, they don't leave us, right? We carry them. It's not for us all to just get healed here. It's actually, like Michael Mead talks about, to be the wounded healers, right? To accept that we're walking through wounded, but that doesn't mean we can't assist, right? That doesn't mean we can't help. And actually those that you work with in the humanitarian sector that are in Gaza and are in the Ukraine and are doing those things around the world, they're not doing that because they're already healed.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That's not the point of all of that. Actually, the point is that there's a shared trauma and there's also a shared joy. There's a shared everything for us to really tap into. And I think at the very essence of this conversation, which I feel like is an exploration of Uranian energy, which has been around in the field right now, it drops down into that of like, the beauty of that, Yeah, Uranus as the Heavenly Father with a crown of stars. That's what his name means. And so there is an ancestral component, but it's a deeper ancestry, right? It's like going all the way back. And when we lose track of that, we flail around on the surface. And when we're in touch with that, we can have perhaps that more courage, more bravery, and more calm, and more trust, and more safety, but not the kind of safety where you're just patching it all up.
Right. Or avoiding it or bypassing it.
All of the above.
Yes.
Amazing, Carolina. Well, thank you so much for coming in and having a little chat on my microphone here.
Thank you. It's been, I think it's going to be percolating for a long time to come. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, that was the intention of us having this conversation it's kind of like a work in progress. And I think it's a work in progress for all of us. Nobody's arriving anywhere. But there is a place on that deep internal that I witnessed in you arrive at earlier than this week. So although we're not going to arrive at somewhere that's safe, somewhere that's calm, some kind of like calm waters for us all to be in, that's not looking like it's going to be around for a little while. There is that deep inner place, that the catastrophe or the catabasis that might be able to take us down.
Yeah. And who knows what we'll find there.
Who knows? All right. Thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to tell the people while we're here? How they can connect with you, how they can find you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you want to connect with me, it's my website is alchemiasoul.com. But I think I just wanted to say that, I think in that sense of vulnerability and courage, I think it's so important to have conversations with people, to reach out for support if you need to. I think whether that's to a therapist or a friend, it's these times we need to have really real conversations. And certainly what I've really appreciated from you, Chris, and from being here today and talking in this way. So, yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. I think that's my strong message to us all.
Yeah, a beautiful and important message, because it can sometimes feel like we're in it alone, and that's a very persistent illusion. But it's not true, and that's definitely a theme of this week with a lot of clients as well, like the courage to actually reach out and say, hey, I would love to, I'm struggling a bit here, and not just kind of go into some isolation, right, and become frozen in the ice of isolation. So
yes,
reach out. There are helpers in this world that can sit with you in a soulful way and just be with it.
Exactly.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thanks for listening, and thanks for joining us. And yeah, you know where to reach Carolina. I'll put her details in the show notes, and highly recommend going back. We've talked previously about Chiron and Asclepius and all of my favorite things. And so highly recommend going back to those episodes as well. Thank you so much for sitting down with me in person. What a treat.
Pleasure.
And till next time. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.